The air in the archival chamber was a constant, cool breath, filtered against the encroaching dust of the mountain pass. Blake moved with practiced economy, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. Each file box, each ledger, each rolled blueprint had its designated place, a testament to decades of meticulous arrangement. The facility itself, an old, repurposed subterranean structure burrowed into the granite heart of the mountain pass, hummed with the low thrum of ventilation systems, a sound as familiar and constant as Blake's own heartbeat. Blake's current task involved the consolidation of the Expeditionary Remains, Circa 1908 collection, a trove of objects and documents recovered from a failed geological survey. Most of it was predictable: rusted tools, brittle maps, water-damaged journals detailing frostbite and rockfalls. Blake found comfort in this predictability, in the quiet order they imposed on the chaos of the past. They wore thin cotton gloves, protecting the fragile paper from oils, and their fingers, though nimble, never rushed. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow on the heavy oak tables, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the otherwise still air. Today, however, a peculiar inconsistency surfaced. Blake was sifting through a wooden crate marked Personal Effects, uncatalogued, Box 7 of 12. Most items were easily identifiable: a tarnished silver locket, a leather-bound almanac, a dried flower pressed between pages. Then, his fingers closed around something else. It was small, no larger than a child's fist, and unnervingly heavy. Blake lifted it, turning it slowly in their gloved hand. The object was a perfect, unblemished cube of an unknown, dark material. It absorbed the light, rather than reflecting it, creating a peculiar visual void in his palm. The surface was impossibly smooth, cool to the touch despite the ambient warmth of the room, and utterly devoid of seams, markings, or any discernible features. Blake's brow furrowed. This object did not fit the profile of the expedition's other artifacts. Their records indicated no such item was ever formally recovered, nor did it resemble any known geological sample from the region of the mountain pass the expedition had traversed. It possessed an alien perfection that contradicted the rough-hewn tools and natural specimens typical of the collection. They placed the cube gently on a clean, felt-lined tray, and retrieved the collection's primary logbook. Page after page, he cross-referenced the manifest against the contents of Box 7. The locket, the almanac, the flower, all accounted for, listed with terse descriptions and acquisition dates. The cube, however, was absent. No entry, no sketch, no marginal note hinting at its existence. It was as if it had simply appeared, without preamble, within the tightly controlled environment of the archive. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through the table beneath Blake's hands. They paused, listening. The low hum of the ventilation system continued, unwavering. The subtle vibration could have been a distant shift in the mountain pass's ancient rock, or perhaps the heavy machinery of a service vehicle on the access road outside. He dismissed it as a minor geological event, common in such a location. Yet, a prickle of unease, sharp and unexpected, traced its way up their spine. Blake pulled out a digital caliper and a microscale. The cube measured precisely 6.2 centimeters on each side. Its weight registered at an astonishing 1.8 kilograms. He double-checked the calibration, then re-weighed it. The numbers remained identical. Such density suggested an exotic, perhaps extraterrestrial, composition, but Blake immediately reined in the thought. Their role was to document, to classify, to maintain order, not to speculate on the impossible. As he leaned closer, examining the cube under a magnifying lamp, they noticed something else. The surface, which had initially appeared perfectly uniform, now seemed to possess a subtle, shifting quality. Not a change in form, but a peculiar visual distortion, as if the very light waves striking it were being subtly warped. Blake blinked, rubbed their eyes, and looked again. They had been working long hours, driven by the desire to complete the Expeditionary Remains collection before the next quarterly review. Yet, the unease persisted, a dull ache behind their eyes. The cube sat on the tray, an inert, perfect anomaly, defying every principle of their ordered world. Blake reached for the camera to document the object, their hand hovering over the shutter button. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to deepen, or perhaps it was just his perception, the sound resonating differently within their skull. The air, previously cool, now felt heavy, pressing. Blake felt a sudden, irrational urge to put the cube back, to bury it deep within the uncatalogued boxes and forget they had ever found it. But their professional integrity, their unwavering commitment to order and record-keeping, held them captive. This object, however unsettling, was now part of the archive. And he, the meticulous archivist, was the one who had brought it to light. The mountain pass, a fortress against the outside world, suddenly felt like a tomb. Blake returned to the archival chamber, the weight of the discovered artifact a palpable presence even before it was visible. They had secured the artifact in a reinforced, climate-controlled drawer, a standard procedure for any item of unknown provenance, but the act felt inadequate, almost futile. Its existence defied standard categorization. They spent the following days in a state of hyper-focused intensity, the methodical rhythm of archival work now infused with an unsettling urgency. Sleep became a luxury Blake could not afford, or perhaps, did not want. The image of the artifact's impossible geometry was burned into their mind, a constant, flickering presence behind their eyelids. It was not merely an object, it was a question, an intrusion into the ordered reality Blake had so meticulously maintained. Their initial examination of the artifact had been cautious, clinical. It was roughly the size of a human head, composed of a material that defied easy identification. It was neither stone nor metal, yet possessed the density of both, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, its surface a matte black that seemed to drink the photons. The angles were the most disturbing aspect, sharp, precise, yet fundamentally wrong, twisting in ways that suggested multiple planes existing simultaneously, or perhaps, no true plane at all. It hummed, a low, barely perceptible vibration that Blake felt more in their teeth than heard with their ears. Blake began sifting through the most obscure sections of the archive, bypassing the digital catalog, relying instead on instinct and memory. They sought anything that might predate known history, any whisper of anomalies, any record of things that simply should not be. The regular demands of the archive were pushed aside. A colleague, the inventory specialist, approached them once, inquiring about a pending catalog update. Blake offered a terse, almost dismissive response, their gaze already drifting back to a shelf of unlabeled folios. The inventory specialist simply nodded, a flicker of concern in their eyes before they retreated. Blake barely registered the interaction. The discovery came in a forgotten section dedicated to miscellaneous uncatalogued acquisitions, pre-1920. Buried beneath ledgers detailing defunct mining operations and geological surveys of the mountain pass, Blake found a series of unbound, leather-bound notebooks. Their covers were cracked, pages brittle, but the ink within remained surprisingly vivid. The script was an archaic form of German, interspersed with Latin and what appeared to be an unknown, angular script. One notebook, in particular, caught Blake's attention. Its pages were filled not with text, but with intricate, hand-drawn diagrams. They were crude, yet disturbingly precise, depicting structures that mimicked the artifact's impossible angles. There were no explanations, only the drawings, rendered in meticulous detail. Blake felt a cold dread bloom in their chest as they compared a particular diagram, a swirling vortex of converging lines and impossible corners, to the artifact. The resemblance was undeniable, terrifying. Reveal/discovery, Blake found a single, fragmented note tucked into the spine of this notebook, written in the same archaic German. This was not an isolated incident. Others had seen, others had recorded. The psychological impact intensified with each passing hour. Blake began to notice subtle shifts in their own perception. The fluorescent lights of the archival chamber seemed to flicker at an irregular rhythm, a subtle strobe effect that no one else appeared to register. Blake dismissed these as fatigue, as the natural consequence of intense focus and lack of sleep. Yet, the unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of their resolve. They felt isolated, adrift in a sea of knowledge that only served to deepen the mystery. How could they explain this to anyone? What words could encompass the unsettling truth of a geometry that defied all known physics? They doubted their own observations, their own sanity. Was the artifact merely a catalyst for a pre-existing fragility, or was it actively influencing their mind? Blake was hunched over the artifact, now resting on a felt mat on their personal workstation, the old diagrams spread around it like an arcane constellation. The low hum emanated from it, a silent song that resonated deep within their skull. They traced one of the notebook's angular patterns with a finger, then looked up at the artifact, its surface absorbing the light, refusing to yield its secrets. Suddenly, the archival chamber itself seemed to warp. The sturdy shelves, usually so reassuringly solid, appeared to ripple, their edges blurring and sharpening in impossible succession. The light from the overhead lamps, usually a steady, cool white, fractured into a kaleidoscope of non-colors, shades that existed beyond the visible spectrum. The air thickened, pressing in on Blake, not with pressure, but with a profound, disorienting presence. It was as if the very fabric of reality, the stable, predictable world Blake had always known, had momentarily thinned, revealing the raw, unadorned structure beneath. A soundless roar filled their mind, a cacophony of impossible frequencies. Blake gasped, clutching the edge of the workstation, their knuckles white. The sensation lasted only a second, perhaps two, before the room snapped back into its familiar, mundane form. The shelves were solid, the light steady, the air thin and cool. But the lingering echo of that impossible perception remained, a residue of horror in their mind. It was not a hallucination. It was a glimpse. A sliver of the truth. Blake stared at the artifact, then at the diagrams, then at their trembling hands. The mountain pass, the archival chamber, the very ground beneath them, it all felt like a thin veil stretched over something vast and indifferent. The artifact wasn't just an object, it was a key. And Blake, alone in the silent, filtered air, had just turned it. Blake re-entered the archival chamber, the heavy door thudding shut behind them, sealing off the familiar silence of the mountain pass. The air, previously just faintly metallic, now carried an acrid, almost coppery sharpness that stung the back of their throat. It was a taste, not just a scent, a visceral intrusion that seemed to permeate the sterile environment. Blake moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision, their gaze fixed on the reinforced display case at the chamber's center. The artifact, a dull, obsidian-like object, rested within its velvet cradle, radiating an unseen pressure. They approached the case, the polished glass reflecting their own taut expression. The object itself was deceptively simple, a flattened ovoid, roughly the size of a human hand, with a surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. But the intricate etchings, like a spider web of impossibly fine lines, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence that Blake hadn't noticed before. It was a deep, unsettling violet, barely perceptible, like a bruise beneath the skin of reality. Blake retrieved the artifact, the cold, smooth weight of it a stark contrast to the sudden warmth that bloomed in their palm. The metallic tang in the air intensified, now accompanied by a low, persistent hum that vibrated in their teeth. They carried it to the heavy oak table, the surface cleared of all other materials, and placed it under the focused beam of a high-intensity lamp. The violet glow deepened, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. "Show me," Blake murmured, their voice a dry whisper in the echoing chamber. They produced a series of archival tools, a magnifying lens, a microscanner, and a set of fine probes. For hours, they meticulously catalogued the artifact's surface, tracing the alien script that spiraled across its form. The symbols were unlike anything documented in the vast archives of forgotten languages. They defied known linguistic structures, appearing as both image and character, each one a miniature labyrinth of impossible angles. As Blake worked, a subtle shift began in their peripheral vision. The shelves, stacked high with centuries of forgotten knowledge, seemed to ripple, their rectilinear forms softening, then hardening again with an unnatural rigidity. The hum grew, a low thrum that burrowed into their skull, blurring the edges of their thoughts. Blake blinked, shaking their head, attributing the distortions to fatigue, to the strain of intense focus. But the coppery taste in their mouth was now overwhelming, and a new sensation prickled at their skin, like a fine dust of static electricity. They pressed on, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. The microscanner projected the artifact's surface onto a larger display, revealing the impossible depth of the etchings. It was not merely a surface inscription, the lines seemed to extend inward, forming three-dimensional pathways that twisted and converged within the object itself. As Blake zoomed in, one particular sequence of symbols began to resolve, not into a language they understood, but into a pattern of pure, unsettling logic. It was a diagram, a schematic of interconnected points, but the connections defied spatial reasoning. As Blake stared, the hum intensified into a high-pitched whine that grated against their auditory nerves. The violet glow from the artifact flared, washing the chamber in an unearthly light. The walls of the archival chamber began to breathe. Not a subtle illusion, but a tangible, rhythmic expansion and contraction. The ancient stone blocks shifted, groaning with a sound that was not geological, but organic. Dust, dislodged by the movement, drifted down in shimmering motes that seemed to hang suspended, caught in the artifact's violet aura. Blake's breath hitched. They felt a profound nausea, a visceral rejection of what their eyes were reporting. A new scent, sharp and metallic, but also cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit left in the sun, filled the air. Blake gripped the edge of the table, their knuckles white. The diagram on the screen pulsed in sync with the perceived breathing of the chamber. They understood, then. Not with words or reason, but with a horrifying clarity that bypassed all conventional thought. The artifact was not merely a record, it was a key. A key to perception. The diagram was a map, not of a place, but of a fundamental flaw, a tear in the fabric of what humanity understood as reality. The cosmic horror was not an entity outside existence, but a foundational, inescapable aspect of it, glimpsed only when the conventional filters of perception were stripped away. The breathing of the chamber became a frantic gasp. The air around Blake thickened, becoming viscous, pressing in on them. Blake felt their own mind unraveling at the edges, their senses overloaded, their grasp on the familiar world slipping. They had deciphered the artifact's true nature. It was not a tool to find the horror, but a lens to see it, to peel back the comforting illusion of order. The cost of this sight was their sanity. The chamber dissolved into a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shapes. Blake was no longer in the archival chamber. They were everywhere, and nowhere, trapped within the horrifying, boundless truth revealed by the pulsating violet object in their hand. The metallic tang was now the taste of their own dissolving reality. It was a taste, not just a scent, a viscous, metallic film coating the inside of their mouth. Blake swallowed, the action dry and difficult, attempting to dislodge the clinging residue. It persisted, a phantom iron tang that seemed to vibrate against their molars. He pressed a hand to his forehead, the skin cool beneath his palm. The low hum that had accompanied the artifact's presence now seemed to resonate within his own skull, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very bones of his face. He walked to the central table, his movements precise, almost mechanical, his gaze fixed on the artifact. It rested there, unassuming, yet its influence was a palpable weight in the room. The air around it shimmered, not with heat, but with an optical distortion, as if the light itself was struggling to bend around something unseen. Blake reached out, his fingers hesitating inches from the object. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, a fundamental disruption of his internal equilibrium. His vision flickered at the periphery, the solid stone walls of the chamber seeming to breathe, their ancient surfaces rippling like disturbed water. He blinked, hard, attempting to clear the distortion, but it clung to his sight, a persistent veil. "What are you doing?" he muttered, the words feeling foreign, thick on his tongue. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the artifact, or to himself, or to some unseen observer. The question felt less like an inquiry and more like a desperate plea for clarity in the burgeoning chaos. His determination, once a sharp, guiding force, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a growing disquiet. He forced himself to touch the artifact. The surface was cool, smooth, utterly unremarkable. Yet, the moment his fingertips made contact, a jolt, not of electricity, but of pure, undiluted sensation, coursed through his arm. It was a cold fire, a silent scream, a vast, empty expanse all at once. The hum in his head escalated into a piercing whine, threatening to shatter the delicate architecture of his inner ear. The archival chamber twisted. The floor beneath his feet became a liquid plain, the walls stretched and compressed, the ceiling receded into an impossible distance. Blake gasped, tearing his hand away, stumbling back from the table. The artifact remained, a singular point of focus in the swirling non-space that had become his reality. He stared at his hand, then back at the object. The coppery taste was now a roar, a metallic ocean surging through his veins. He could feel it, a physical presence, within his own body, intertwining with his blood, his nerves, his very thoughts. A memory surfaced, unbidden and fragmented, a conversation with a colleague about a long-lost text, a forgotten language. But the words were wrong, the face of the colleague distorted, their voice a guttural drone. Was that memory real? Was he real? The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. Blake clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp. His own name, Blake, felt alien on his mental tongue, a label affixed to something he no longer recognized. He closed his eyes, desperate for respite, but the internal landscape was no less terrifying. Patterns of impossible geometry pulsed behind his eyelids, shifting and reforming with nauseating speed. He saw himself, or a version of himself, standing in a field of endless, featureless gray, the artifact hovering before him, not as an object, but as a gateway. A gateway not to another place, but to a different kind of existence. The reveal hit him then, not as a thought, but as a pervasive, undeniable truth that settled deep within his bones. This wasn't an external force invading his reality. This was reality itself, stripped bare, revealing a fundamental, underlying horror that had always been present, woven into the very fabric of being, like an unseen thread in a tapestry. The artifact was merely a lens, a catalyst, allowing him to perceive what had always been there, just beyond the threshold of human comprehension. His identity, his memories, his very sense of self, were not just unraveling, they were being rewoven, thread by thread, into this new, terrifying tapestry. He was no longer Blake, the archivist. He was a conduit, a receptor, a single, screaming nerve ending absorbing the truth of existence. The hum was the sound of reality's true machinery. The archival chamber, the mountain pass, the world beyond, they were all dissolving, not into nothingness, but into an infinite, all-encompassing horror that was now, irrevocably, a part of him. He was no longer a distinct entity, but a permeable membrane, dissolving into the vast, indifferent truth. The coppery sharpness in the air of the archival chamber was no longer a mere scent, it was a physical sensation, coating Blake's tongue, grating against the back of their throat. The heavy door, a solid slab of reinforced steel and stone, had sealed them in, the thud echoing not just in the chamber but deep within their skull. Blake moved towards the pedestal, a determined purpose overriding the tremor that had begun to manifest in their hands. The artifact rested there, its surface a shifting tapestry of impossible geometry and iridescent hues that seemed to absorb and refract the dim chamber lights in ways that defied physics. Blake had come back for answers, for the complete picture, even as a creeping certainty whispered that some knowledge was best left undisturbed. The previous encounters with the artifact had been piecemeal, fragments of understanding that shattered more than they illuminated. Now, there was no turning back. The world outside, the familiar mountain pass, felt distant, a fading memory. Only this chamber, this object, and the terrifying truth it promised, held any reality. As Blake approached, the air around the artifact shimmered, not with heat, but with a different kind of energy, an unseen pressure that pushed against their eardrums. Blake reached out, their fingers hesitating an inch from the artifact's surface. It pulsed, a slow, deep thrum that vibrated through the stone floor and up their legs. They closed their eyes for a moment, steeling themselves. The archival work had always been about order, about cataloging the past into neat, discernible categories. This artifact defied every principle of their profession, every logical framework they had ever known. It was an anomaly that threatened to unravel not just the archive, but the archivists themselves. When Blake's eyes opened, the chamber seemed to have deepened in color, the shadows clinging to the corners like grasping tendrils. The artifact was no longer merely resting on the pedestal, it seemed to be part of it, or perhaps the pedestal was part of it. The lines between object and environment blurred. Blake's breath hitched. They saw a faint, almost imperceptible tremor run through the very walls of the chamber, as if the stone itself was alive, breathing. Driven by a morbid fascination, a need to know that dwarfed all fear, Blake touched the artifact. The sensation was not what they expected. It was like touching a concept, a memory, rather than a solid object. And as their fingers made contact, a deluge of information, not visual or auditory, but pure, unfiltered understanding, flooded Blake's mind. It was not a revelation of a creature, a monster with teeth and claws. It was far more insidious, far more fundamental. Blake understood, in that agonizing instant, that the artifact was not a tool, not a record, but a fragment. A fragment of the underlying reality that hummed beneath the thin veneer of human perception. The truth was this: there was no other reality. There was only this reality, vast and formless, of which human existence was a fleeting, accidental ripple. The cosmic horror was not an invader from outside, but the true, raw, indifferent essence of everything. It had always been there, not lurking, but simply being, utterly oblivious to the tiny, intricate narratives humanity had constructed to make sense of its brief flicker of consciousness. Blake saw it, not with their eyes, but with their entire being. They saw the true, chaotic dance of fundamental forces, the silent, ceaseless reordering of existence. The archival chamber, the sturdy walls of the mountain pass, even Blake's own body, began to lose their coherence. They became patterns, vibrations, temporary arrangements of energy within an infinite, indifferent field. The coppery taste in their mouth intensified into a searing burn, not of acid, but of pure, undiluted existence. Their sense of self, the unique collection of memories, fears, and hopes that constituted Blake, began to fray at the edges. It was like a thread slowly unspooling, each strand dissolving into the vast, indifferent tapestry. There was no pain, only an overwhelming sense of expansion, of becoming diffuse. Blake was not dying, they were unbecoming. The artifact pulsed brighter, no longer just reflecting the dim lights, but emanating its own internal luminescence, a soft, impossible glow that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The chamber's walls rippled like water, then ceased to exist as solid objects. Blake was no longer standing on a floor, but suspended in a boundless, shimmering space, where forms coalesced and dissolved with the merest shift of thought. The ultimate horror was not malevolent, it was simply indifferent. It had no will, no desire, no malice. It simply was. And Blake, in their desperate pursuit of knowledge, had merely opened the door for a drop of water to rejoin the ocean. The archival chamber, high in the mountain pass, remained silent. The heavy door, a solid slab of reinforced steel and stone, stood shut. The pedestal was empty. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was out of place. The archive continued its quiet vigil, a monument to order, oblivious to the fact that one of its custodians had simply ceased to be a separate entity, becoming instead a silent, integral part of the incomprehensible truth that hummed just beyond the threshold of human perception, forever unresolved, forever present.